February 1942. Somewhere in the Pacific, a Japanese intelligence officer sits, hunched over a radio intercept, his headphones pressed tight against his skull. For weeks, his team has been cracking American codes with remarkable success. They have decoded Army transmissions, intercepted Air Corps dispatches, and even sent false messages in American code to lure Marines into ambushes. The Imperial Japanese intelligence apparatus has proven itself among the finest in the world. But now, filtering through the static, comes something that makes no sense whatsoever. A weird succession of guttural, nasal, and tongue-twisting sounds. Not English, not any Asian language, not German, not French, not Russian, not any language any cryptanalyst in the Japanese Empire has ever encountered in their lives. The officer writes down phonetic approximations and sends them to his superiors. They pass through the hands of Japan's finest codebreakers, men who have dedicated their careers to the mathematical art of decryption. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, months turn into years, and not once, not a single time during the entire Pacific War do they decipher a single word. Every message remains locked. Every transmission remains a mystery. The greatest cryptanalytic minds in the Japanese military establishment cannot crack what they are hearing. This is the story of the most beautiful weapon ever designed in modern history, forged from a language the American government had spent 60 years trying to destroy. The idea began not with a general, not with a cryptographer, not with any military strategist, but with a missionary's son who grew up playing with Navajo children in the Arizona desert. Philip Johnston was born on September 17, 1892, in Topeka, Kansas, the son of a Protestant minister named William Johnston. When Philip was 4 years old, his father felt called to serve the Navajo community and moved the entire family to Flagstaff, Arizona, establishing a mission near the edge of the Navajo reservation. Young Philip spent his childhood running through the high desert with Navajo boys, learning their games, their customs, and most importantly, their language. He learned it so completely, so fluently, that by age 9 he could serve as a translator between tribal elders and the President of the United States. In 1901, Navajo leaders traveled to Washington to petition President Theodore Roosevelt for an expansion of reservation land by executive order. The matter was urgent, the discussions were complex, and the interpreter who stood between Navajo chiefs and the American president was a 9-year-old white boy from Arizona. Roosevelt granted the petition. The land was expanded, and Philip Johnston understood, even at that young age, the unique power of speaking a language that almost no one else in America knew. Johnston served in the Army during World War I with the 319th Engineers, shipping to France with the American Expeditionary Force in 1918. He saw firsthand the chaos of battlefield communications, the vulnerability of coded messages that could be intercepted and decrypted by enemy intelligence. After the war, he earned a civil engineering degree from the University of Southern California and settled into a career with the city of Los Angeles. He might have lived out his days as an unremarkable municipal engineer, drawing up plans for roads and bridges, his childhood among the Navajo nothing more than a distant memory. But in early 1942, with America reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor, he read a newspaper article that changed everything. The story described how the Army was using Native Americans during training maneuvers in Louisiana, echoing the success of the Choctaw Telephone Squad in World War I. During that earlier conflict, 8 Choctaw soldiers in the 36th Division had transmitted messages in their native language during the final Allied offensive, baffling German intelligence. Johnston saw an immediate opportunity. If Choctaw had worked in 1918, Navajo would work even better now. The language was more complex, more obscure, and spoken by a population so isolated that no foreign power would have had any reason to study it. The very next day, Johnston visited the Naval Office in Los Angeles. They redirected him to the 11th Naval District in San Diego. Eventually, he made his way to Camp Elliott, where he met Major James E. Jones, communications officer for the Amphibious Force, Pacific Fleet. Johnston made his pitch with the passion of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment, without knowing it. The Navajo language, he argued, was unlike anything the Japanese had ever encountered. It was tonal, meaning pitch could change the entire meaning of a word. The syllable pronounced one way might mean you, while the same syllable with different pitch might mean, he said. Its verb system was among the most complex of any language on Earth, with verbs carrying up to 11 prefix positions, 7 modes, approximately 12 aspects, and forms that changed based on the physical shape of the object being described. A single Navajo verb could convey as much information as an entire English sentence. The language had no written form at the time. Its syntax, with subject, object, verb, word order, polysynthetic morphology, and animacy hierarchies, was utterly alien to anything a Japanese cryptanalyst might have encountered in their training. And crucially, Johnston claimed, no German or Japanese scholars had ever studied it. The Navajo reservation was simply too remote, too isolated, too far removed from academic interest. Jones was intrigued but skeptical. Military communications were no place for theoretical arguments. He needed proof. He arranged for Johnston to demonstrate his concept before senior officers. On February 28, 1942, just 3 months after Pearl Harbor, Johnston staged a formal demonstration at Camp Elliott before Major General Clayton B. Vogel, commanding general of the Amphibious Corps, Pacific Fleet. Johnston had assembled 4 Navajos from the Los Angeles area and one already on active naval service in San Diego. Vogel was a practical man who had risen through the ranks of the Marine Corps. He had no patience for gimmicks. He installed a telephone connection between 2 rooms and personally composed 6 messages, typical of combat communications, the kind of transmissions that would be sent during an amphibious landing under fire. The Navajos had no codebook, no training manual, and no preparation. They quickly improvised word and letter substitution methods, transmitting messages from English to Navajo and back again. One test message read, "Enemy expected to make tank and dive bomber attack at dawn." When it came through on the other end, it read, "Enemy tank dive bomber expected to attack this morning." Not verbatim, but the military meaning was perfectly preserved. More importantly, anyone listening to the transmission, any Japanese intelligence officer monitoring American frequencies, would have heard only incomprehensible syllables, sounds that bore no resemblance to any coded language they had ever encountered. Vogel was impressed. On March 6, 1942, he wrote to the Marine Corps Commandant recommending the recruitment of 200 Navajos. He cited that the dialect was completely unintelligible to other tribes, unlike some Native American languages that shared common roots and could be partially understood by speakers of related tongues. He noted that only about 28 non-Navajos in the entire world possessed more than superficial knowledge of the language. The Commandant, cautious but intrigued, authorized a pilot program of just 30 recruits. But here is where the story takes its first bitter turn. Marine recruiters arrived on the Navajo reservation in April 1942, visiting Indian agency schools at Fort Wingate and Shiprock in New Mexico and Fort Defiance in Arizona. These were not ordinary schools. These were not places of learning in any genuine sense. These were institutions built on a single philosophy, articulated most clearly by Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, in 1879. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. That was the guiding principle. Eradicate the culture, destroy the language, transform the child into something that looked like a white American. Beginning in the 1880s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and church-run institutions had operated a network that would grow to over 400 boarding schools across 37 states. Navajo children were taken from their families, sometimes voluntarily surrendered by parents who believed the schools offered opportunity, often forcibly removed by government agents. They were given English names. Their hair was shorn. They were dressed in military uniforms. They were forbidden to practice their traditional ceremonies. And they were beaten, sometimes with belts, sometimes with rulers, sometimes with fists, for speaking their own language. Chester Nez was sent to a boarding school at Tohatchi when he was 8 years old. He had no choice in the matter. He was assigned the name Chester after President Chester A. Arthur, an irony he would appreciate only later. At the school, he was forbidden to speak Navajo. When he slipped, when the sounds of his mother's tongue escaped his lips, he was punished. He remembered having his mouth washed out with yellow laundry soap for speaking Navajo. The taste of that soap, the humiliation of that punishment, stayed with him for the rest of his life. Carl Gorman attended Rehoboth Mission School in New Mexico. The treatment was so harsh, the punishment so severe, that he ran away. Keith Little, another future code talker, recalled the rules. They had the real, strong disciplinary rule that we don't talk our native language. The purpose was clear: to be converted to Christianity and to take us away from our cultural religions and our beliefs. And now the same government that had spent 60 years punishing children for speaking Navajo was asking those children, now grown into young men, to use that language to save American lives. The recruiters did not acknowledge this contradiction. They probably did not even think about it. They needed Navajo speakers. The children they had beaten for speaking Navajo were now the only Americans who could provide what the military desperately required. On May 4, 1942-29, Navajo recruits boarded a bus at Fort Defiance, Arizona. They traveled to the induction center at Fort Wingate, where they were sworn into the United States Marine Corps and were transported overnight to San Diego. The next day they arrived at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot and were organized as Platoon 382, the first all-Navajo platoon in Marine Corps history. Many had never left the reservation. Some had never ridden a bus. Few had birth certificates, as the reservation kept no standardized records of births. This made age verification impossible, and multiple recruits exploited this fact to their advantage. Chester Nez was still in 10th grade and lied to appear older, eager to serve despite everything his people had endured. Carl Gorman, at 34, was over the maximum enlistment age of 30 and lied in the other direction, claiming to be younger. He wanted to fight, and he was not going to let an arbitrary age limit stop him. He was the oldest of the original 29. Later, Peter MacDonald would enlist at just 15, after his older Marine cousin Tom came home on furlough wearing a sharp dress uniform. The uniform was so impressive that MacDonald made himself old enough to join. They graduated boot camp on June 27, 1942, transformed from reservation boys into United States Marines. Then they moved to Camp Elliott for 8 weeks of communications training. But their primary mission was not to learn the existing systems. It was to create something entirely new. The Navajo Code was not simply the Navajo language spoken over the radio. It was a dual-layered code within a code, designed entirely by the original 29 themselves, with little formal cryptographic training and no professional guidance from military intelligence. The Marine Corps essentially said, "Figure it out," and they did. 3 additional Navajo Marines were added during the development phase, making 32 men who actually built the system that would baffle Japanese intelligence for the duration of the war. The first layer was a military vocabulary. The code talkers needed words for tanks, submarines, bombs, aircraft, artillery, infantry movements, and coordinates. Every piece of military equipment and tactical concept that had no equivalent in the traditional Navajo language. The Navajo did not have words for dive bombers or aircraft carriers or machine gun nests. These were objects and concepts entirely foreign to their culture. So the code talkers created words by matching characteristics, drawing on their deep knowledge of the natural world. Tanks became Che-Dagahi, meaning tortoise, because both had hard protective shells and moved slowly across difficult terrain. Submarines became Beshlo, meaning iron fish, a perfect description of vessels that swam beneath the waves. Bombs became a Yeshi, meaning eggs, dropped from aircraft like eggs from a bird. Fighter planes became Dahitihi, meaning hummingbird, for their speed and agility in combat. Battleships became Lotso, meaning whale, the largest creatures in the sea. Destroyers became Lo, meaning shark, predators of the ocean. Grenades became Nimasi, meaning potatoes, round objects that could be thrown. Dive bombers became Genie, meaning chicken hawk, for the way they dove from the sky to strike their prey. For America, they chose Nehi Ma, our mother. It was a deliberate choice, a statement of loyalty despite everything. This was their land. This was their home. This was what they were fighting for. Initially, they created 211 terms. As the war progressed and new equipment and tactics emerged, this vocabulary expanded to approximately 411 terms by war's end. The second layer was a phonetic alphabet for spelling out proper nouns, place names, technical terms, and unfamiliar words that could not be represented by the military vocabulary. Each English letter was assigned at least one Navajo word. A could be Wolachi, meaning ant, or B Lasana, meaning apple, or Tsenil, meaning axe. B could be Na-Hash-Chid, meaning badger, or Shush, meaning bear. This redundancy was intentional. When a cryptographer monitoring transmissions warned that letter-by-letter spelling was creating frequency patterns vulnerable to analysis, that the Japanese might be able to identify common letters by how often certain Navajo words appeared, the alphabet was expanded from 26 to 44 terms. The most common English letters received multiple alternatives. A code talker spelling a message could vary which word he used for each letter, making frequency analysis impossible. Training was intense and unforgiving. They memorized the entire vocabulary and alphabet until every term was committed to memory. No written materials were ever permitted in the field. The codebook existed only in the classroom. If a code talker was captured, there would be nothing on his person that could help the enemy crack the code. The code existed only in the minds of the men who used it. Many code talkers later credited the Navajo oral tradition of storytelling and memorization with preparing them for this challenge. Navajo culture had always valued the preservation of knowledge through memory. Stories, ceremonies, healing prayers, all were passed down through generations without writing. A people who had never needed paper to preserve their wisdom were ideally suited to carry an unwritten code into battle. The final 2 weeks of training involved field exercises with actual radios and field telephones under simulated combat conditions. The sounds of artillery, the chaos of movement, the pressure of urgency, all were replicated as closely as possible. A code talker who could not reproduce the entire code from memory under stress could not deploy. There were no exceptions. The stakes were too high. A single error, a single hesitation, a single moment of confusion could mean the death of Marines who were counting on accurate coordinates reaching the right commanders at the right time. The speed advantage was staggering and would prove decisive in battle. A 3-line English message that took 30 minutes to encode, transmit, and decode using standard mechanical encryption could be handled by code talkers in approximately 20 seconds, accurately, completely. And with no electronic equipment beyond a standard field radio, code talkers saw their first combat on August 7, 1942, when 15 Navajos landed at Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division as part of the first Allied land offensive against Japan. The island was covered in dense jungle, the Japanese were dug in and determined, and the Marines needed reliable communications to coordinate their assault. Chester Nez arrived in early November 1942 and later recalled his first battlefield transmission. A runner came sprinting through the undergrowth, ducking enemy fire, and handed him a message. "Enemy machine gun nest on your right flank. Destroy." Nez spoke into his radio in Navajo. Coordinates went out. An artillery strike came screaming in. The machine gun nest was obliterated. It was, he said, exhilarating. The code's effectiveness was demonstrated when a skeptical signal officer gave the code talkers a message he believed would take hours to process through standard encryption. They completed it in minutes, without a single error. Commanders were converted on the spot. The Navajo Code rapidly became, in the words of a 3rd Amphibious Corps report, indispensable for the rapid transmission of classified documents. From Guadalcanal, the code talkers spread across the Pacific Theater, participating in every major Marine assault of the war. At Bougainville in November 1943, they manned distant outposts, maintaining radio contact with the front lines through dense jungle and heavy rain. At Tarawa in November 1943, where Marines suffered terrible casualties storming fortified beaches, code talkers transmitted casualty reports and coordinated the deadly advance. At Saipan in June and July 1944, Carl Gorman was photographed manning an observation post overlooking the town of Garapan while Marines consolidated their positions below. He and a fellow code talker were later injured by a mortar shell during litter duty, carrying wounded Marines to safety. At Guam in July and August 1944, Chester Nez was wounded in the foot, but continued transmitting. John Kinsell Sr. discovered the bodies of Chamorro civilians, indigenous islanders who had been murdered by retreating Japanese soldiers. The horrors of war were everywhere, but the code kept working. At Peleliu from September through November 1944, the fighting was so savage, the Japanese defenses so deep, that Nez later said he felt that he was barely hanging on to his sanity when he finally left that blood-soaked island. But Iwo Jima became the code talkers' defining moment. February 1945. The Marines were preparing for an assault on an 8-square-mile volcanic island, 750 miles south of Tokyo. Intelligence knew this would be different from any battle before. Japanese Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months transforming the island into a fortress of interconnected tunnels, bunkers, concealed artillery positions, and pillboxes carved directly into the volcanic rock. Intelligence estimated 21,000 Japanese defenders dug into the island. The beaches were pre-registered for mortar and artillery fire. Every inch of ground would be contested. The Marines expected heavy casualties. On the ships heading toward the island, troops received their final briefings. Thomas Begay, serving with the 27th Marines of the 5th Marine Division, recalled the dread that settled over the men. On the ship, they said, "Get your last scrap of steak and eggs." That gave some kind of feeling in my stomach. What am I doing here? What's going to happen? Major Howard Connor, signal officer of the 5th Marine Division, made a decision that would define the battle's communications. The entire operation would be conducted via the Navajo Code. No mechanical encryption, only Navajo. On February 19, 1945, the assault began. Marines hit the beaches and immediately began taking casualties from the entrenched Japanese positions. What followed were some of the most intense hours of the Pacific War. 6 code talkers manned radio nets, operating around the clock, transmitting coordinates for naval gunfire support, relaying troop positions, calling in airstrikes on Japanese bunkers, reporting counterattacks, directing reinforcements. The battle raged for 36 days. The Japanese were listening to every transmission, monitoring every frequency, attempting to decode every message, and they understood nothing. The language was impenetrable. Connor later reported what those 6 men accomplished. The entire operation was directed by Navajo Code. During the first 48 hours, while we were landing and consolidating our shore positions, I had 6 Navajo radio nets operating around the clock. In that period alone, they sent and received over 800 messages without an error. Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. When American forces raised the flag on Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945, the moment captured in the most famous photograph of World War II, the first transmission announcing the news went out in Navajo Code. The flag is up on Suribachi, encoded in the language of a people the government had once tried to silence. One persistent danger code talkers faced came not from the Japanese but from their own side. Their physical appearance, with dark hair, bronze skin, and features that could appear Asian to frightened soldiers who had never seen a Native American, led some American troops to mistake them for Japanese infiltrators. At Guadalcanal, an army patrol seized a Navajo communicator on a coastal road and reported to their superiors, "We have captured Japanese in marine clothing with marine dog tags." He was released only when a Marine officer who knew him personally arrived and identified him. Multiple code talkers experienced being held at gunpoint by fellow Americans. The confusion was dangerous and recurring. As a result, some code talkers were assigned bodyguards. Their primary stated duty was to prevent these friendly fire incidents, to vouch for the code talker's identity when challenged by suspicious troops. But according to Bill Toledo and other veterans, the bodyguards may have carried a secret secondary order that was never written down. If a code talker was about to be captured by the Japanese, the bodyguard was to shoot him to prevent the code from being compromised. Chester Nez addressed this directly after the war. "I don't know whether our bodyguards had orders to kill us rather than allow us to be captured." The Marine Corps has been asked if this was so, and they denied it. He added, "At any rate, no code talker was ever executed by his bodyguard. The situation never arose. The code was never compromised." At Okinawa, from April through June 1945, the final major battle of the Pacific War, code talkers fought for the full 82-day duration. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, one of the most famous journalists of the war, observed the code talkers at work and described how Navajos had put on a ceremonial dance before leaving for Okinawa. In the ceremony, they asked the gods to sap the strength of the Japanese in the assault. Throughout the war, the Japanese tried desperately to break the Marine Code. Their intelligence services had demonstrated considerable skill with American encryption. English-speaking Japanese soldiers had successfully sent bogus messages in American code to lure Marines into ambushes on multiple occasions. They were not incompetent. They were not lazy. They were among the best cryptanalysts in the world. The failure was overdetermined. No Japanese national had ever studied Navajo. The language's extreme tonal complexity was completely alien to their linguistic experience. Even if someone had understood conversational Navajo, the code's reassigned vocabulary would have rendered transmissions nonsensical. Iron fish meant nothing without knowing it designated submarines. The expanded alphabet defeated frequency analysis. And the code's extraordinary speed, messages encoded and decoded in seconds, gave cryptanalysts almost no time to work with intercepted material. But the Navajo Code defeated them completely. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, Japan's chief of intelligence, admitted after the war's end that while his teams were able to decipher the codes used by the United States Army and Army Air Corps, they never cracked the code used by the Marines. The most dramatic proof of the code's impenetrability came through the experience of Joe Kiyomiya, a Navajo soldier serving with New Mexico's 200th Coast Artillery Regiment. Kiyomiya was not a code talker. He had never been trained in the code. He was simply a Navajo man who joined the army. He was captured after the fall of the Philippines in early 1942 and survived the infamous Bataan Death March, in which thousands of American and Filipino prisoners died from exhaustion, starvation, and execution. The Japanese initially tortured Kiyomiya because his surname and features led them to believe he was a Japanese American, a traitor to their race in their eyes. Months of beatings followed before they finally accepted his Navajo identity. Then their interest took a different form. When baffled by intercepted Navajo transmissions, the Japanese brought Kiyomiya written transliterations of the code words. They showed him the sounds they had transcribed and demanded he translate. Kiyomiya recognized individual Navajo words. He could hear his own language in the transcriptions, but he could make no sense of the coded messages: iron fish, turtle, eggs, hummingbird. As military designations, these words were completely meaningless to an untrained Navajo speaker. The code was incomprehensible even to a native speaker of the language. He told his captors it sounded like nonsense, because to him, it did. For this failure, for his inability to help them decode messages that he genuinely could not understand, he was stripped naked and forced to stand in 6 inches of snow until his feet froze to the ground. When a guard shoved him, the frozen skin tore from his soles. "I left my soles on that parade ground," he later said. He was transferred to Nagasaki, where he was imprisoned when the atomic bomb fell on August 9th in 1945. He survived only because the concrete walls of his cell shielded him from the blast. After the war, Kiyomiya encountered a code talker and told him, "I never figured out what you guys who got me into all that trouble were saying." In a 1995 interview, decades after the war's end, he declared, "I salute the code talkers, and even if I knew about their code, I wouldn't tell the Japanese." He died on February 17, 1997. The war ended. The code talkers had helped win it, and then they were told to forget everything. The code remained classified until 1968, 23 years after the Japanese surrender, because the Marines judged it potentially valuable for future conflicts during the Cold War. If the United States ever faced another enemy, the Navajo Code might be needed again. So the men who had used it were explicitly sworn to secrecy upon discharge. One veteran recalled the instructions verbatim. "When you get home, you don't talk what you did. Don't tell your people, your parents, family. Don't tell them what your job was. This is going to be a secret. Don't talk about it. Just tell them that you've been in the service, defend your country, and stuff like that." They returned home on buses without parades, without fanfare, and without recognition. Their military discharge papers made only single-line references to communication duty, nothing about codes. Nothing about intelligence, nothing about the crucial role they had played in every major marine assault of the Pacific War. Peter MacDonald later reflected, "Not even our parents knew what we did in the war. The whole project was top secret." Chester Nez struggled with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The dead visited him in his sleep. "They were all around me," he said. "I actually see them alongside my bed." But he could not explain to anyone what he had experienced or why. The war he had fought was classified. The trauma he carried was his alone. The men who helped save the Pacific Campaign came home to poverty. Many returned to the reservation to find no jobs, no livestock, and no recognition. Veterans' benefits under the GI Bill existed in theory, but were often inaccessible on the reservation, where banks, colleges, and vocational training centers did not exist. Some code talkers, like Chester Nez, managed to attend college with their benefits. Many others returned to herding sheep on the same land where they had been children before the war, their heroism unknown even to their neighbors. When Code Talkers returned, many participated in the Endar, the Enemy Way ceremony, a traditional Navajo healing ritual involving prayer, talking circles, drumming, and sweat lodges. The ceremony was designed to restore balance after the spiritual disruption of combat, to help warriors release the violence they had experienced and reconnect with the harmony of their homeland. Alfred Gibson, a Navajo spiritual leader, explained the logic. When soldiers go overseas, we give them warrior ceremonies to armor and protect them against the battle. When the soldier comes back, we have to remove that armor to help him reconnect with his home. Chester Nez found the ceremony effective for the visions that haunted him. The dead began to visit less frequently. John Kinsel Sr.'s uncle barely recognized him when he returned from the Pacific, so changed was he by what he had seen. A medicine man held a ceremony welcoming him home, restoring his spirit to the land of his birth. The Code Talkers' willingness to serve cannot be understood without the history that preceded their recruitment. In 1864, Colonel Kit Carson conducted a scorched earth campaign against the Navajo, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, destroying everything that allowed the people to survive on their land. Approximately 8,000 to 10,000 Navajos were forced on a series of forced marches, the Long Walk, covering 250 to 450 miles to the internment camp at Bosque Redondo, near Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Hundreds died on the marches from exposure, starvation, and soldiers' bullets. Those who fell behind were shot. Those who resisted were killed. Over the 4-year imprisonment at Bosque Redondo, between 2,000 and 3,500 perished from disease and starvation. Chief Barboncito's plea in 1868 captured the anguish of a people who had been driven from everything they knew. Cage the badger, and he will try to break from his prison and regain his native whole. The Treaty of Bosque Redondo, signed June 1, 1868, allowed the surviving Navajos to return to a fraction of their former homeland. Then came the boarding schools. Then the 1930s livestock reduction, when Commissioner John Collier ordered the slaughter of more than half of all Navajo livestock. The sheep, goats, and horses were considered sacred gifts from the holy people. They were the economic foundation of Navajo life, and the government slaughtered them by the thousands. Chester Nez watched his family's herd reduced drastically. One elder's account captures the collective trauma. The government came and took the cattle and the sheep, and they just shot them. They threw them into a pit and burned them. Our people cried. They thought that this act was another long walk. Through all of this, Navajos were technically United States citizens only after the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, but could not vote in Arizona or New Mexico until 1948, or in Utah until 1957. Some Code Talkers who had risked their lives across the Pacific came home to states where they could not cast a ballot. Chester Nez recalled arriving home in his Marine uniform only to be told by a Bureau of Indian Affairs bureaucrat, "You're still not a full citizen, you know." Despite this history, approximately 44,000 Native Americans served in World War II. Code Talkers explained their motivation in terms that transcended any grievance with the federal government. The concept of protecting Dinétah, the sacred homeland between the 4 sacred mountains, was paramount. America in the Navajo Code was Ne-hi-ma, our mother. The path to recognition stretched across decades. In 1968, the program was finally declassified after new electronic encryption methods rendered the code concept obsolete. In 1969, the first official reunion was hosted by the 4th Marine Division in Chicago. Code Talkers received bronze medallions, and a representative of President Nixon read a message honoring their service. It was the first time anyone outside their small community acknowledged what they had done. In 1971, Code Talkers held their own reunion at Window Rock, Arizona, and the capital of the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Code Talkers Association was formed. President Nixon sent a letter of appreciation. In 1975 and 1976, Code Talkers marched in the Rose Parade in Pasadena and walked at the front of the Bicentennial Parade in Washington. After Code Talker, Thomas Begay wrote to Arizona Congressman Eldon Rudd, a fellow Marine, asking why Congress had never formally recognized them. President Ronald Reagan declared August 14, 1982, as National Navajo Code Talkers Day and presented certificates of recognition. In 1992, 35 surviving code talkers attended the dedication of a Pentagon exhibit. On December 21, 2000, President Clinton signed Public Law 106554, the Honoring the Navajo Code Talkers Act, awarding Congressional Gold Medals to the original 29 and Congressional Silver Medals to all subsequent code talkers. On July 26, 2001, President George W. Bush presented the Congressional Gold Medals in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. Of the original 29, 5 were still alive after 59 years. 4 attended in person: John Brown Jr., Chester Nez, Lloyd Oliver, and Alan Dale Jr., elderly men now, their hair white, their bodies bent, but their memories intact. The 5th surviving member, Joe Palmer, was represented by his son Kermit Palmer. Bush declared, "We recall a story that all Americans can celebrate, and every American should know. It is a story of ancient people called to serve in a modern war. It is a story of one unbreakable oral code of the Second World War, messages traveling by field radio on Iwo Jima in the very language heard across the Colorado Plateau centuries ago." In November 2001, more than 300 subsequent code talkers received Congressional Silver Medals at a ceremony in Window Rock. Chester Nez became the most visible face of the code talkers, and eventually the last surviving member of the original 29. Born January 23, 1921, in Chichiltar, New Mexico, to the Black Sheep clan, he lost his mother at age 3 and endured the boarding school system's cruelty before volunteering to use his forbidden language for his country. He fought at Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Guam, and Peleliu with the 1st and 3rd Marine Divisions. His 2011 memoir, Code Talker, written with Judith Sheese Avila, remains the only first-person account by one of the original 29. When asked why he enlisted despite everything his people had suffered, he answered, "People ask me, why did you go? Look at all the mistreatment that has been done to your people. Somebody's got to go. Somebody's got to defend this country. Somebody's got to defend the freedom." 10 days before his death at 93 on June 4, 2014, he recorded a final message for all Marines serving around the world. "All you Marines out there, wherever you are, come home in one piece. As Corporal Chester Nez, I say to you guys that are out there, Semper Fidelis." Carl Gorman, the oldest of the original 29, served at Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tinian, and Tarawa, despite being over the maximum enlistment age. After the war, he attended the Otis Art Institute on the GI Bill, becoming a pioneering Native American artist who refused to paint in the flat, two-dimensional style then expected of Native painters. He joined the faculty at University of California, Davis in 1969 to help develop its Native American Studies program. The C.N. Gorman Museum was established there in his honor. His son, R.C. Gorman, became one of the most celebrated Navajo artists in history, called the Picasso of American Indian artists by the New York Times. Carl died on January 29, 1998, 3 years before the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony. His widow accepted the medal from President Bush on his behalf. Peter MacDonald enlisted at 15 after his older cousin came home wearing a Marine uniform. He served with the 6th Marine Division from 1944. After the war, he earned an electrical engineering degree at the University of Oklahoma and worked on the Polaris nuclear missile project at Hughes Aircraft Company before returning to the Navajo Nation. He served multiple terms as Navajo Nation tribal chairman, beginning in 1971, co-founding the Council of Energy Resource Tribes and the American Indian National Bank. As of early 2026, he remains alive at age 97, one of only 2 surviving code talkers. Thomas H. Begay is the other surviving code talker. He served with the 5th Marine Division at Iwo Jima and was the one whose 1982 letter to Congressman Rudd catalyzed the creation of National Navajo Code Talkers Day. He attended the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day at the World War II Memorial in Washington in May 2025. The most recent code talker death was John Kinsell Sr., who passed on October 19, 2024, at age 107. He had served with the 9th Marine Regiment at Bougainville, Guam, and Iwo Jima, where he was wounded. His son Ronald announced his passing in words that honored both American and Navajo tradition. Chey passed early this morning in his sleep. The howling wind brought his parents and relatives that came for him early dawn today. Between 400 and 420 Navajo men served as code talkers out of approximately 540 Navajos who served as Marines during World War II. 13 code talkers were killed in action. The code vocabulary grew from 211 terms to 411, with the full system, including the expanded alphabet encompassing over 600 words and phrases. Over 800 messages were transmitted at Iwo Jima in 48 hours without a single error. The code was never broken. Not once. Not by any analyst in Japan. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, Japan's chief of intelligence, confirmed this after the war. The United States Marine Corps considers the Navajo Code modern history's only unbroken military code. In March 2025, Peter MacDonald criticized the Pentagon's inadvertent deletion of Code Talker web pages during website reorganization. Removal was bad, he said, and I consider it to be a serious mistake. Navajo Code was a weapon, the most beautiful weapon that was ever designed in modern history. A planned National Navajo Code Talkers Museum near Window Rock may not be completed before the last 2 code talkers pass from this earth. Chester Nez captured the central paradox of this story better than anyone else who lived it. All those years telling you not to speak Navajo and then asking for help with that same language. It still kind of bothers me. In his memoir, he wrote that he was extremely proud to serve as a Marine and very proud that my language, which we had been forbidden to speak the entire time I attended boarding school, ended up being one of the main reasons we won the war in the Pacific. The language the government tried to kill became the weapon the enemy could not crack. The children who were beaten for speaking their mother tongue grew into warriors who spoke it across the battlefields of the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, in every major marine assault of the war. They transmitted coordinates that destroyed enemy positions. They called in airstrikes that saved American lives. They relayed the news when the flag rose over Suribachi. And they kept silent about all of it for 23 years, returning home to reservations where they could not vote, where their people had been marched to their deaths within living memory, where their culture had been systematically dismantled by the very government they had just saved. They served anyway. They came home anyway. And when their country finally acknowledged what they had done, many of them were already dead. Today, only Thomas Begay and Peter MacDonald remain. They are the last 2 men alive who can tell us what it was like to speak an unbreakable code under fire. The last 2 witnesses to what happens when a nation realizes, perhaps too late, that the very thing it tried to destroy was the thing that could save it. When they are gone, there will be no one left who remembers the sound of the code being spoken in battle, no one who knows what it felt like to hear their forbidden language become a weapon of war. No one who can look you in the eye and tell you what it meant to defend a country that had not yet learned to defend them. The Navajo Code Talkers did not fight because America had been good to them. America had not been good to them. They fought because they loved their land, their families, their way of life. They fought because someone had to defend the sacred mountains. They fought because, in the end, this was their home. Nehima, our mother.